You know how some people think they can just take what isn't theirs and get away with it? Well, imagine serving your country overseas, risking your life every single day, only to come home and find out that the very land you worked hard to buy has been sold right out from under you. That's exactly what happened to me. And the people behind it? The same homeowners association that was supposed to protect the neighborhood. The story begins while I was deployed overseas. I had bought a piece of land years before, a nice empty lot in a subdivision. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine. I had paid it off completely, kept my taxes up to date, and had all the paperwork stored safely. Because I was in the military, I didn't have time to develop it or build anything on it, so it just stayed open, vacant, but not forgotten, at least not by me. Now here's the thing about vacant land. To outsiders, it looks abandoned. To neighbors who don't ask questions, it looks like wasted space. And to an HOA that gets too big for its boots, it looks like an opportunity. I wasn't there to mow the grass. I wasn't there to trim bushes. I wasn't there to put up fences. To them, it looked like I had just walked away. Months turned into years. And while I was away serving in places most of these people couldn't even point out on a map, the HOA got bold. They decided that since no one was taking care of the lot, it was theirs to deal with, without ever reaching me, without ever mailing to my legal address on file, without ever checking the county records. They branded it abandoned and moved fast. One day, the HOA board made a deal with the developer. They sold my land at a fraction of its value. Imagine that. The property I worked for, that I sacrificed for, was traded away like a piece of junk furniture at a yard sale. And the neighbors? Oh, they were thrilled. Finally, they said, the empty eyesore was going to become something useful. They thought new houses would raise their property values. They thought the HOA had done something smart. Meanwhile, I was thousands of miles away in a desert, in uniform, with no idea what was happening. Every day I woke up, strapped on my gear, and focused on my mission. Back home, papers were being signed. Plans were being drawn. Ground was being broken. No one told me a thing. By the time I returned home, the subdivision had changed. I drove through, expecting to see my land waiting for me, the same as I left it. Instead, I saw survey stakes, construction trucks, and worse, the beginnings of houses, right there on the very lot I owned. At first, I thought I had the wrong address. I checked the numbers, I checked my maps, but no, it was my property, the one I had bought and paid for, now crawling with workers and machinery. When I confronted the HOA president, she didn't even flinch. She told me, straight-faced, that the HOA had taken over the vacant property and sold it for the good of the community. Like she was doing me a favor. Like she hadn't just robbed me blind while I was halfway across the world in combat. I didn't buy that land on a whim. Years before I ever left for deployment, I worked extra shifts, saved every spare dollar, and cut back on almost everything just to afford it. While my friends spent money on cars and nights out, I kept telling myself it would all be worth it one day. That little plot wasn't just dirt and grass to me. It was supposed to be my anchor, a piece of stability in a life where nothing stayed still for long. When you're in the military, you move around a lot. You're stationed here, then there, sometimes across the country, sometimes across the world. Nothing really feels like it's yours for very long. But that land? That was different. It didn't matter where I got sent. I knew it was there, waiting for me. Proof that I wasn't just drifting from one base to the next. Proof that I was building towards something permanent. The neighborhood where the land sat was nothing fancy at first. It was quiet, tucked away, with plenty of undeveloped spaces. That's what I liked about it. It felt open. It felt like I had room to breathe. I didn't care about the HOA when I bought it. To me, the board was just a group of people who managed the streetlights and trimmed the community bushes. They weren't supposed to have power over my future. I figured as long as I paid my dues and followed basic rules, they'd leave me alone. I was wrong. The funny thing is, the HOA never complained to me directly. They never sent me a real warning. Sure, maybe a few letters got tossed around, but not one reached the official mailing address I had listed. Not one phone call. Not one certified notice. It was easier for them to assume the worst, that I had forgotten about my property, than to admit they didn't do their homework. Before I deployed, I even updated my records. I gave the proper contact information. I had it written clearly in the county office. If the HOA had truly wanted to reach me, they could have. But they didn't. They wanted the land to look abandoned. They wanted it to be easy to claim. I can only imagine the meetings they had, sitting around their little conference table, whispering about how that vacant lot was dragging down home values. Maybe they pictured weeds taking over. Maybe they didn't like the way it looked compared to their perfect lawns. Maybe they were just greedy, hoping to get rid of it and cash in when new houses went up. Whatever the reason, they convinced themselves it was theirs to take. And while they were busy plotting, I was thousands of miles away doing things they would never understand. My days weren't about lawns or fences. They were about sand, heat, and missions that left me too exhausted to think about anything else. The last thing I expected was that the fight I'd return to wouldn't be overseas. It would be right in my own backyard. Back home, the subdivision was changing fast. Developers were circling, ready to squeeze every dollar out of every square foot. Houses were springing up like mushrooms after rain. The HOA wanted to look like heroes, the kind of people who improved the neighborhood. But they weren't heroes. They were thieves, and my land was their prize. I trusted the system to protect me while I was away. There are laws that say property owned by service members can't be touched. I thought those laws were enough. I thought respect for someone who wore the uniform would be enough. Turns out, it wasn't. Sat in the car for a long minute, staring, waiting for my brain to catch up. It didn't feel real. I kept looking at the street signs, double-checking the address. But no matter how many times I checked, the truth wouldn't change. They were building houses on my land. I walked up to one of the workers and asked what was going on. He shrugged, barely looking at me, and said the HOA had sold the lot to a developer. As if that explained everything. As if that was normal. I told him there had to be some mistake. He pointed toward the subdivision office and said, "Take it up with them." Then he went back to hammering nails into what was quickly becoming someone else's dream home. I didn't waste time. I marched straight into the HOA office and demanded answers. The president, a woman who had probably never worked a day outside her suburban bubble, sat behind the desk with a smug little smile. She didn't act surprised to see me. In fact, it was like she had been waiting for this moment. When I told her that lot was mine, she leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and said, "Actually, it isn't. It was classified as abandoned, and we sold it to a developer months ago." Just like that. No apology, no hesitation. She said it like she was reading from a script. I pulled out my documents right there, copies of the deed, proof of tax payments, everything in black and white. She glanced at the papers, pushed them back across the desk, and repeated the same line. It was vacant and unmaintained. We had the right to sell it. Her voice was dripping with arrogance, as if she believed the HOA's word carried more weight than county records or federal law. I asked her why they hadn't contacted me. She smirked and said, "We sent notices. You didn't respond. You weren't here. Someone had to take care of the property. That's when it clicked. They never wanted me to respond. They didn't want me to show up. They wanted it to look like I had disappeared so they could take what wasn't theirs. And the worst part? The neighbors supported it. They were happy to see construction on that lot. In their eyes, I was the absentee owner who had left an eyesore in the middle of their perfect subdivision. Not one of them questioned where I was. Not one of them asked why a soldier might not be home to mow his lawn. To them, my service didn't matter. My sacrifice didn't matter. All that mattered was their property value. Standing in that office, listening to her condescending tone, I felt something inside me shift. Shock was giving way to anger. And anger, well, that was about to become fuel for something much bigger. I walked out of that HOA office with my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the raw anger boiling under my skin. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. They had sold my land like it was some unwanted junk sitting at the edge of the street, and now they were acting like I had no say in it. I sat in my truck for a while, staring at the half-built houses on my property, trying to wrap my head around how anyone thought this was legal. The first thing I did when I got home was dig through every single file I had. Deed, tax receipts, property surveys. I laid it all out on the kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene. Every piece of paper screamed the same thing. The land was mine. The HOA had no authority to sell it, no matter how vacant it looked. They had overstepped, plain and simple. But it wasn't just about the paperwork anymore. It was about what they had done while I was gone, while I was out there serving. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just theft. It was a direct attack on me as a service member. There are laws in place to protect deployed military from this exact situation. The Service Members Civil Relief Act exists for a reason. It stops people from seizing your property when you're away on active duty. The HOA either didn't know about it, or worse, didn't care. And both possibilities lit a fire inside me. I started documenting everything. Pictures of the construction, copies of every letter I could get from the county, detailed notes of my conversation with the HOA president. I wasn't going to let them twist the story. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd make sure the truth was written down in black and white. Next, I reached out to people I knew. In the military, you build connections over time. Lawyers, legal advisors, even people in local government who respect what you do. I told them what happened, and every single one of them was stunned. Some laughed in disbelief, others shook their heads in anger, but all of them agreed on one thing. The HOA had messed up in a way they weren't walking away from. One friend in particular, a JAG officer I had served with, told me exactly how bad this would look in court. He explained that not only had they violated property law, they had trampled over federal protections that carried serious consequences. You're holding all the cards, he said. They just don't realize it yet. So while the HOA was busy celebrating their new development deal, I was quietly stacking my case. Every late-night phone call, every scanned document, every signed affidavit, it all built a wall they wouldn't be able to climb. I didn't go storming into meetings. I didn't raise my voice at neighbors. I played it calm, even when I wanted to scream, because I knew something they didn't. Once the military stepped in, this wouldn't just be a property dispute anymore. Meanwhile, the construction didn't stop. Every morning, I drove past and saw more walls going up, more trucks unloading materials, more strangers walking around like they belonged there. It was surreal, watching someone else's dream rise on land that was legally mine. And every time I passed by, I reminded myself, every nail they hammered, every brick they laid, was just another piece of evidence I would use against them. The HOA thought they had won. The neighbors thought I would roll over and accept it. But I wasn't built to roll over. Not after everything I'd been through. They had no idea what kind of storm was coming their way. When the paperwork was finally ready, I filed my case. It wasn't just me versus the HOA anymore. It was me, with the full weight of the law behind me. The moment the court documents hit their desk, the smug looks started to fade. Suddenly, they weren't so confident. Suddenly, the president who told me my land was abandoned was hiring lawyers and scrambling for excuses. The best part? They had no ground to stand on. Every record showed the same thing: my name on the deed. My taxes paid, my rights fully intact. Their entire defense was built on a lie, that I had neglected my property. But the law doesn't care about tall grass or untrimmed bushes. The law cares about ownership, and ownership was mine beyond question. The judge didn't take long to see what had happened. My Jad friend had been right. This wasn't just a civil matter. It was a federal violation. The HOA had trampled all over protections for deployed service members, and the court was not amused. What they had done wasn't a mistake. It was reckless. It was illegal. And now, it was about to cost them everything. When the ruling came down, it hit the HOA like a wrecking ball. The entire sale was voided. Every agreement with the developer was wiped clean. And because the construction had already begun, the fallout was massive. Those half-built houses, they weren't the developers anymore. They weren't the HOA's. They were mine, sitting right there on land they never had the right to touch. The military's involvement made it even harsher. A repossession order was issued, forcing the HOA to hand everything back immediately. It wasn't negotiable. It wasn't up for debate. One moment, they thought they owned a thriving subdivision project, and the next, it was ripped right out of their hands and dropped back into mine. Neighbors who had cheered when the bulldozers rolled in suddenly had a new expression on their faces: fear. Because now, the houses they thought would boost their property values belonged to me, not them. And the HOA they trusted to handle everything? They had just been exposed as thieves who gambled with someone else's future and lost in the biggest way possible. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. People who once waved at me with smug smiles now avoided eye contact when I drove by. The half-finished homes stood like silent reminders of the HOA's arrogance, and now they were mine to decide what to do with. Some of the families who had already put down deposits came knocking at my door, desperate and nervous. They wanted to know if they could still move in, or if they had just thrown their money into a black hole. I didn't answer them right away. I wanted them to feel the same uncertainty I had felt when I came home to find strangers building on my land. For weeks, I had been left in the dark, treated like my rights didn't exist. Now it was their turn to wonder what came next. And behind the scenes, the HOA was crumbling. Their board meetings turned chaotic, members shouting at each other, pointing fingers, demanding explanations. The same president who once told me, "You weren't using it anyway," was now drowning under the weight of lawsuits, fines, and angry homeowners. What made it worse for them was the paper trail. Every shady deal, every skipped step, every ignored law, it was all on record. The county had started their own investigation, and whispers of fraud charges floated through the subdivision. The HOA, once so proud and controlling, was nothing more than a sinking ship. Meanwhile, I held the power. With the repossession order in my hands, I wasn't just the rightful owner of my land anymore. I was the landlord of their future. Those who wanted to stay on what had become my property would now have to deal with me directly. And I wasn't in the mood to play by their comfortable little rules. The sight of HOA members who once dismissed me, now lining up, papers clutched in their hands, begging for leniency, It was a moment I'll never forget. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated the law. And most of all, they had underestimated what happens when you push a soldier too far. The day the subdivision officially became mine was the day everything flicked upside down for the HOA. Their authority was gone in an instant. The board that once strutted around giving out fines and notices now had no ground to stand on. They couldn't enforce a single rule because they no longer controlled the land beneath their own homes. Every family who once saw me as the absentee owner now realized their fate rested in my hands. I didn't need to say much. The documents spoke louder than any words ever could. The repossession order was crystal clear. Every house, every driveway, every inch of the subdivision had been built on stolen property. And stolen property goes back to the rightful owner. That rightful owner was me. Some neighbors were furious, shouting in driveways, blaming the HOA for dragging them into this mess. Others were silent, their eyes filled with regret, finally understanding the cost of siding with arrogance. The HOA president, who once smirked at me across her polished desk, couldn't even look me in the eye anymore. She was the one who had pushed hardest for the sale, the one who convinced everyone it was the right move. Now she was facing lawsuits from the homeowners, questions from the county, and whispers that the state attorney might come knocking next. Her empire of control had turned into rubble. But while they panicked, I stayed calm. I walked the streets they once claimed as their kingdom, knowing every inch now belonged to me. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. The power shift was so complete that silence was louder than victory speeches. The people who thought I'd roll over and accept their theft were now realizing I held the cards and I was in no rush to play them. Every unfinished home, every yard, every crack in their plan reminded them of the choice they made when they decided to sell what wasn't theirs. And now, the irony couldn't be sweeter. The subdivision they believed would boost their value had become my property, and the HOA that tried to erase me had managed to erase itself instead.